Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute. That's Community Advocates for Young Learners, or CAYL. It's my honor to welcome you to this webinar series, the CAYL Catalyst webinar series, in which we hope to offer timely, relevant, and immediately actionable topics of interest to early childhood educators. Among the hundreds of people joining this webinar today are dozens of community-based advocates and school principals who have been involved with CAYL programs over the years since we were established in 2003. So I really want to welcome them back, and I particularly extend my gratitude to all of you for your leadership. Today's webinar is on a topic that we offer as an invitation and as a challenge. Want it? New leadership for young learners. We issued this invitation and challenge because, especially now, it is critical for us to understand the importance of thinking simultaneously about the field's present and our aspirations for the future. Now is the time that we must engage each other in order to nurture our collective thinking about advancing early childhood education as a field of practice. And perhaps there's no one better prepared to kick off this conversation than our guest speaker, the talented and knowledgeable Dr. Maurice Sykes. Maurice knows children and has a great respect for the people who work with them. He has diverse experiences as a teacher, director, teacher educator, and author. Throughout this webinar series, we present the voices of practitioners every time. And today we have Corrine Corso, an administrator from Massachusetts, and Marta Rosa, a leader in the child care resource and referral movement and a higher education executive. This webinar is brief. It's only an hour, but we invite you to put your questions and reflections throughout the presentations in the chat and the Q&A section. And as you think about leadership that we need for our field and the future of early childhood education, we have to begin with an understanding of our current context, because there's no doubt these are challenging times for all of us in the early childhood education profession. The rules of the game have changed, and change is no longer an option if it ever was. In every place and every setting, there are new rules, new guidelines, fewer children and families being served, and increased expenses. Many people are worried about their employment. Maybe they don't have employment anymore, or they're afraid of going to their job because not being able to be vaccinated. So let's start with something that's very important to acknowledge, and that is each of us in this field, you and all of us together, are enough to do the things that we have been called to do. We are resilient leaders of a profession that has been undervalued and misunderstood, yet we rise to the occasion time and time again to lead and to serve. I am very proud of how you and how all of us are showing up to educate children, families, communities, and our legislative leaders. You deserve and have earned the accolades and respect of many people and groups who maybe never really saw us before. We're here today because of the leader you already are. And we want to acknowledge you, encourage you, and let you know that we offer you our thanks. When we think about the leadership that's needed for young learners, we know that change is coming at us from all directions. With all of us working so hard and investing so much, we are ready to make this nation the best place for children to grow up. We don't want to fall below what our sister nations are doing for infants, toddlers, childcare, and preschool. And we know we have the skill and talent and the opportunity to help create profound and fundamental change in our communities. Change that builds upon the lessons of the past, but also creates synergy that comes from the leadership we need now and in the future. I'm inspired right now. I'm inspired because I know that what we do makes a difference every day. And there is still so much to be done. Our present circumstances seem so dominating right now, but we can still think about and prepare for the future and remember our strengths and successes, things we've done consistently well that inspire us, give us courage, and provide us with the power to move forward. There are over 2 million of us now and growing. And we are not now, nor have we ever been, powerless in the face of many daunting challenges. Still, there's a lot of work to be done. There is a resounding sense of urgency that we hear all over this country. We know that moving forward is a complex challenge that is complicated by the field's lack of clarity about its purpose, identity, and responsibilities. And if we want to move forward in this field and to professionalize this field and the society in which our field is embedded, we are going to have to grapple with thorny topics like stable financing and workforce qualifications, facility management now more than ever, governance systems, program standards, and public expectations. And in every single one of these issues, it is the early childhood educator that works directly with children that must be at the forefront of creating the change that we need. We need to change our minds about some things. We need to engage in adaptive work, that whole process of creating change, in order to advance our field and to tackle the choices that are in front of us. Wanted new leadership for young learners. Another key reason we have to examine our leadership is because the children themselves have changed. Effective teaching and raising young children in the 21st century has to be based on knowledge about this generation alpha, those children born since 2010, because they've changed the game. They've changed the game because of who they are. They're diverse, they're tech savvy, and they're being nurtured in complex and constantly changing families. So, my friends, we have to do the work, the adaptive work that our children and our families need. And the reason we have to do this work is because we have to close the gap between what we know and what we do, our aspirations and our behaviors. We have to realize there's no single right answer. We have to do the work to find out what our collective beliefs are. And to do that, we have to start with understanding our differing views and mobilize the people who will do the work. So thank you again for joining us in this webinar. Let's begin. Wanted new leadership for young learners. Let's listen to the words of the master of our profession, Dr. Maurice Sykes. Maurice?
Good afternoon, Valora.
Good afternoon.
How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. I'm just curious. I mean, I know I have been presented as presenting a keynote, but you know, I really think that, are we showing up? Yes. That we should, as early childhood folk, try to pretend, because early childhood people believe in pretending. Yes, my video is on. I don't know why I'm fading out. Now it's off. Now it's on. But what is that? So technology is wonderful when it works. What is, it looks like the green monster.
It does. We wish we had a Generation Alpha kid to show us how to work this technology. Maybe we could just show your photo while you're speaking.
Well, that'll do.
Okay.
So we can remedy this situation. We're very fine. So instead of, and now it's even more, the camera is blocking, someone said. Now more so than my camera is blocking. There we go.
Yes.
There, are we okay now?
Yes.
Good.
We see you now.
Thank you, Barbara. Um, so I think we, instead of thinking of being in a big hall and keynoting, we're going to pretend because early childhood people like to pretend. So let's pretend that we're in a pub or a bistro or a neighborhood bar having a conversation and not necessarily a keynote address. And to that end, just in this conversation, I think that there are, two things that that new leaders need to consider before we do any of our work, and that what we have to consider and address as leaders are what I call the twin pandemics, because we are facing two pandemics. One, which is medical, that is caused by a virus, and one that is social, that is caused by historical systemic racism. And leaders have to confront both of those. And working, I did a session on leadership in the time of twin pandemics. But the context for what new leaders or new leadership has to do is in the context of these twin pandemics. And leaders have to attend to those. And because both are causing excruciating pain and agony among children and adults, that new leaders must lead children and adults out of what I call the valley of despair, because we cannot pretend that we have not been affected by these twin pandemics. And it is in that context that new leaders have to lead. And I think that it is important that we acknowledge that the care providers, wherever you work in the early care and education field, that we all have been pretty much traumatized by these twin pandemics. And therefore, leaders have to start by attending to the well-being of children and adults. I mean, much of what we read talks about the social emotional impact on children, but there is also a social emotional impact on adults, and new leaders have to attend to both of those. I remember back when people actually flew, when it was safe to fly, and some say it's still safe to fly. I read before the holidays, someone asked in the travel section, is air travel safe? And the answer back to them was, it is very safe if the airplane drives up to your front door. So airlines save traveling by plane, but it's not so desirable right now. But back in the day, for those who remember, and these would not, certainly, we're not talking about alpha kids, but those kids who were in my age cohort, you remember when on the airline they would say, and if you're an adult flying with young children, first apply the mask to yourself and then to the children, because young children need healthy adults to guide, to lead, and support them. And in these twin pandemics, we need to be healthy, and we need to look after the well-being of ourselves as well as others. And so I just want to frame this conversation, this pub, bistro, neighborhood bar conversation, by contextualizing it within the context of the twin pandemics that we are challenged to work within. But the well-being of children and adults is first and foremost caring for them, looking in on them, checking on them. So as we think about the theme for today's conversation, wanted. So I have a poster that I would share with you if I had the time that reads, wanted change leaders with guts and courage. And at the bottom it says reward. Guts and courage. Guts as in personal courage, determination, toughness of character. That's what Guts, that's leadership. Guts has to do with your personal courage, your determination, and your toughness of character. And courage, which I write about in the last chapter in my book, Doing the Right Thing for Children, courage is the mental or moral strength to venture, to persevere, to withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. To withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. And for sure, we are in difficult times, trying to make, as I say to some people, the best of a bad situation. But our acknowledgement, our self-acknowledgement that these are tough times to maneuver, to challenge ourselves, to move through. And what children, our young learners, need most from us are what we call the roots and wings and gift of time. You know, I just realized a few days ago that many programs, and certainly some child development centers, some schools, some other programs that serve young children, that our children will have been out of the loop for almost a year come March, a year. And even those who have been in session, I mean, we certainly would wonder what has been the quality of the experience, because it's hard to teach children when you are in fear of your well-being and, you know, your well-being and the children's well-being. So how much focus can you have when you are worried about yourself, your well-being, the children's well-being, the families that we serve's well-being? I mean, all of these things are at play as we try to lead. And there is, you know, I know this will be controversial, but I'm sure that is in part why Valora asked me to be a part of this conversation. But everyone's rushing to reopen. And I just pose the question, reopen for what? I mean, what do we plan to do? And, you know, I think that this is a good time. Certainly for me, I've been thinking about it a lot, but we need to consider the aims of education. I mean, is the purpose of early care and education simply so that adults can go to work? I mean, is that our purpose? Are we there to support people going to work? Are we there? You know, I've heard other people tout the importance of children going to school and to child development programs so that they will have a decent meal. And I ask again, is that the aim of early childhood education? And then I've often heard people say, well, you know, children are suffering and there's an increase in child abuse. And I challenge us again to ask the question, is that the purpose of early care and education? So, I mean, I just think these are questions that we need to pose and think about, because one thing that I am certain of, if we don't define who we are and what our aims are, others will define us for us. And so these interesting things that are popping up, I mean, I know a lot of people are arguing, oh, now they know that we're important. They understand the importance of early care and education. Now we're finally getting some respect. I advise you to listen to what is being said, because it doesn't sound very respectful to me. But again, one person's opinion. So we need new leaders and new leadership. We need courageous leaders who are progressive in their thinking and transformational in their action. So you can be a leader who is, you have the title, but we say leadership is a verb and not a noun. So it is not that you are called leader, and we have leadership on many levels. I mean, everyone in their own right is a leader, because there are times when we are a leader and there are situations where we're being led. So we're all leaders. But what do progressive leaders, because I said we need leaders who are progressive in their thinking and transformational in their actions. And so leaders who are progressive in their thinking, they are forward thinking, they look toward the future in terms of what is possible. You know, a lot of people are doing a rear view leadership, you know, wishing for the good old days. I don't know what the good old days were and when they occurred, but there's a lot of rear view leadership, and progressive leaders are forward thinking. They are innovative. They're always thinking about new ways of solving old problems. So they're innovators, they're creative, they're imaginative. They're also optimistic, because leadership requires that we have a positive vision toward the future. You know, people who know me well know that one of the things that sends me around the bend and off the ledge is when people say to me things like, well, it is what it is. I mean, that is such a fatalistic perspective. And so I'm into positive optimism. And I think that in the times of these twin pandemics, that is really what is required. Progressive leaders are also systems thinkers. They think in systems. One of the guiding rules of systems thinking is in order to change a system, you have to study the system that you want to change. So new leaders need to have systems thinking as a part of their portfolio of skills and knowledge and dispositions, a disposition toward being a systems thinker, studying the system that we spend a lot of time reacting to what is happening, but we're not paying attention to all aspects of the systems. And one of the things in systems thinking is about looking beneath the surface. What is contributing to the factors that keep this system reinforcing itself? So to think in systems is what progressive leaders need to know and understand and be able to do, and something that Valora referred to earlier, and I've heard her throughout her talks talk about adaptive leadership. And as it relates to where we are now, adaptive leadership really has to do with dealing with problems for which there is really no visible solution. Most problems have a technical solution, but adaptive leadership requires us to think beyond what is. There is no ready-made consultant who can come in and help us figure out how to maneuver through these uncharted waters. And so this is where our adaptive leadership skills. So we need to think in systems, and we need to think as adaptive leaders. This is the role of the progressive leader. And then we have that they are transformational in their actions. And to be transformational, a leader really has to be courageous, once again, optimistic. We have to keep our spirits up. We have all been to the valley of despair. And anyone who tells you they haven't been depressed at some point in the last 10 months or 8 months or however long we have been somewhat sheltered in place, if they tell you they've not been depressed, they're not telling the truth. I don't want to use that other word because we tell children not to use that word, but they're not being truthful. And it's hard to bring yourself up out of it, but you got to get out of it. And if you're a leader, people don't want to follow someone who sounds depressed all the time. So you have to put on a happy face. And then transformational leaders are empathetic. They understand, they know where people are coming from. They can step into other people's shoes and feel their pain and help move them along the continuum. So they're empathetic, they are principled, that people want leaders who say what they mean and mean what they say. You know, the book, one of my favorite books is Mrs. Wishy-Washy. And so principled leaders are not wishy-washy. You know, they have a set of guiding principles that they adhere to and ensure that everyone else in the organization adheres to them as well. And then finally, transformational leaders have a passion for action. I mean, what is the sense of it all if we don't bring about change? And so a passion for action is a passion for bringing about change. And so we have to consider, as we think about these new leaders with guts and courage, what there's a whole restoration process, I feel, that we have to consider as new leaders for young learners. And again, it is a restoration for children and adults. I always underscore the importance, and I have from the beginning of our dealing with this pandemic, I've cautioned people, pay attention to the social, emotional state of the teachers. And I do a lot of work every week. I work with teachers, and one of the first exercises we do is around teacher well-being. We have to make sure that the teachers are in good stead. And so part of our restoration or our recovery, we need leaders who can address the losses that have been experienced by teachers and children. And the first loss that we new leaders need to consider is the loss of freedom. The loss of freedom that adults and children have experienced and are continuing to experience. So the first one is the loss of freedom. The second loss is the loss of routine. I was joking with someone about, you know, trying to get out of my pajamas on it the other day. I dressed up for you all today. So the loss of routine, the loss of opportunity, the loss of friendships, and the loss of connectedness. So those are the losses that new leaders need to consider. I'm going to stop here and ask Corrine, what do you think about what I've been talking about? I'm off and you're on.
Okay, I really liked when you talked about passion for action, that we need our new leaders to think about if they're going to bother, they need to absorb this and really put this out there, because that is what we see our children and the adults, and not only the teachers, but also the families who, because of the pandemic, we aren't seeing as much, and we aren't able to bring them into the program like we used to. So they, know how important they are to us and to their children. And they have to be innovative, like you said, the new leaders that we're looking for in today's reality, which is requiring nimbleness on the part of these innovative and courageous teachers. And that's part of what we're looking for them to be. Again, how do you, in today's new world, react courageously, but also supportively for your children, your teachers, and also those other adults that are in those children's lives that we are just used to being, making them still feel valued to us. And again, the advocacy component that you mentioned, that we also need to be the advocates of who we are and what we want our field to be, because if we don't, like I said, the other people are going to define us. And it is so true. I mean, like Valora mentioned, we've always been, for teachers, low valued, but giving such high value. And we need to really, strike while the iron's hot in that regard, where people are thinking about that. What is it that we are adding to society? We've always known that impact is high and worth a lot, long-term, short-term, strategically to the benefit of society, not only economically, but also socially and intellectually. And we need to really now be very forceful about the value, the intrinsic value of teachers and what they bring to
Right.
early care and education. So, Marta, your comments?
Let me unmute and do video. Great,
Okay.
I'm here. Thank you, Corrine. And thank you, Maurice, for that provocative talk. I want to focus my comments a bit on this issue of courage and guts. I really like that, Maurice. That spoke to me. And you know, we have an opportunity, as Valora said earlier, to shift our mindset as people who care about this field, care about children, care about families. But we need leaders with courage and guts. And let me phrase it this way. I've been thinking a whole lot in the last, as we look at these two pandemics that you were talking about, the twin pandemics, and we probably have an economic pandemic to add to the twin pandemic.
Right.
The social pandemic, a racial pandemic, you can go on, right? This has been a year for the history books. But we need people who have the courage to collect the right data in this new era that we're living in. Restoration is going to call for us to really know who is in the community. So can we collect the racial and ethnic data and ask who the children are? What are the languages spoken? In order to plan and rethink services, we need to know who they are. You know, how many teachers speak Spanish? What are the services that we need? Who are the immigrant children moving into communities? The states need to be asking those questions. I should be able to call my state office and ask who are the children that are being served and who are the children whom we're not serving and why, and get some answers. So that culturally relevant planning happens, we need data. And we need it on race and ethnicity, and people are very reluctant to capture that data and to ask for it. We need reflective representation at all the decision-making tables. We can't have tables that are all white any longer. We just can't.
Right.
We need to know who's planning for the children and families. Who is deciding the programs? When all the money comes from the federal level in the next few months, who's going to decide where it goes? Who is it going to go to? Who is it going to serve? Who's at the table to make those decisions? We need to be asking those questions. And we need people who are in positions of power to not be shy about asking who's not at the table. We need to shift to be more inclusive, right? In our efforts, we need to shift to make sure that we have people at the table that understand the community in our field.
Right.
And we need them to ask it out loud. There was a story about the village where the question is, how are the children? That's how people greet each other. We should be able to have those leaders at tables who are asking, how are the children? And not just to be content that they were invited and they're part of the table, but to open up the tables. We need innovative thinking. I really like that, Maurice. Where the children are, the services ought to follow. If this pandemic taught us anything, is that when the systems in place do not meet the need, the community rises to meet its own needs. And so we saw an exacerbated use of kith and kin care. But guess what? We turn our heads from that because it's not the licensing care.
Right.
And we don't know what to do with it. We don't understand it, even to this day. And so we turn our heads. And so we can't turn our heads because that's not licensed. You know, sometimes I wonder in the suburbs when neighbors help each other, that's seen as a really good thing. But in inner city, when immigrants are helping each other, we worry about abuse and neglect. Think about that. Controversial perhaps, but think about that. What are the biases that we're bringing into our thinking, to our planning, into our planning processes? So we need family support strategies. We need leaders who can turn us to family support strategies. And even more important, the question then becomes, as I turn this over to the group conversation, do we value all children equally? Is it equitable? Do we value them enough to go the extra mile to make sure that we're engaging in authentic conversations with people who understand and speak the language, the culture, and conditions in these diverse neighborhoods? So anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it to our group conversation with Valora.
I want to just comment on your notion about, you're talking about the Maasai warriors who ask, and how are the children? And I mean, I think fundamental to this conversation is the lack of regard that this country has for children. I mean, we have to, everything that you say is correct. I mean, I agree with, I don't mean correct, like you're right. But it, you know, I agree, but you know, our fundamental disregard for children and children of color also is important because, you know, Malaguzzi talked about the image of the child. And why, you know, the answer to your question about why is it acceptable in the suburbs and not in the inner city. So, I mean, we can't get around structural racism and classism and gender bias. And I will add children bias because I don't think there's a strong positive disposition. Remember, this country has not signed on the UN Charter on children. Okay, so, I mean, you have to contextualize this stuff in its real, the real deal. And so what concerns me is I don't want us to replicate. We know why the women of color are not at the policy table. You know, I mean, that is structural as well. But I do think we have the opportunity to rethink, reimagine, and reconstruct what early care and education is. And that's why I talk about the aims. I do not want, and people are rushing back to reopen, but to do what? To replicate the same inequities that existed before. And I mean, I'm talking across the board. I'm concerned about what we do with children, who teaches children, how they teach them, what, you know, what they are doing. I mean, the achievement gap didn't happen by accident. And certainly children of color, if the K-12 system has great disparity, do you think the birth to 5 system doesn't have some of the same disparities? Do children in inner cities get the best teachers and the best prepared teachers and the highest paid teachers? So all of these are systemic issues. And actually, Marta, you just made me think about all that stuff as you were talking. I am right on with you and everything you said. I'm just pushing us to think about this in a larger geopolitical context. I mean,
well, I mean, I think back to what Valora says in her book, especially, is that, you know, we're now in a place where we know more than what we do. We can't fall back on before when we didn't know what was good for children. We know that's the science now, and yet we don't rise to that occasion with our dollars in the early care and education field. But here we might have, like you said, before we open, Maurice, now that we have an opportunity that we're going to have money coming down, should we, and we should put those money into early care and education where we know it's going to do the best good, because we have the knowledge. We've just never acted on it as fully as we could. For the country that we are and the money that we have, we are behind.
Well,
and Valora points this out very succinctly in her book.
But it's not about dollars. See, it's about cents, and not C-E-N-T-S, S-E-N.
Yeah.
So we got the dollars, but we don't have the sense. Right thing for
We also, Maurice, don't have the political will.
Right.
We're in the richest country in the world, but we don't have the political will to put the money behind our children.
Right.
And
or you just said we don't value the children.
And we haven't had the courage to ask the questions and to call racism out when it's happening, right? So we're all, sometimes as people of color, sitting at all white tables. And we've been invited.
All white tables all my life. You know that.
Exactly.
That ain't
so
nothing.
how do we change that? How do we move that? Because without reflective leadership, we're going to go back to the same old, which wasn't good enough and wasn't equitable to begin with.
But it's about guts and courage. You can sit at those tables and say the right thing. See, I always tell people, once you get over your fear of loss of employment, you can advocate for children. And so, yes, we sit at the, but we have to call the question. And those of us who are fortunate enough, I don't get invited to many tables, I can assure you, because I am a truth speaker. And I had never been reluctant to speak truth to power. You ask my parents if they were still living. So I mean, I have always questioned and challenged the power elite. And so when we talk about we are the we. And we need to step up and call the question. And all this money is coming down, but you know what? I haven't heard. We ask more money, more money, more money, but where is the discussion of teacher compensation in this? I don't hear it. And people say, well, it's there. We need to be explicit because we lost, I believe, a great opportunity to make our case in this pandemic. And we talked about diapers and dividers and everything but the bottom line, which is pay equity. Pay equity, gender equity, and race equity should be our battle cry. And anything short of that is just a waste of a conversation. I'm going to be quiet for a moment.
Well, I'm loving, go ahead, Marta.
No, go ahead, Valora. I just totally agree.
Go ahead. I love the way this conversation's going. If we can all get together and have this conversation, I love to see more comments in the chat or in the Q&A. You're talking about transformation and restoration. I want to focus on those words. One of the things in my new work, which is changing the game, one reason we have to transform is the children. We always should have transformed, but we know now that the children that we are working with from birth to 8, the majority of them are children of color. And we also know for children who live in rural areas and other areas, the inequities are so plain. We used to say we didn't know. We know this now so clearly. And so transformation and restoration, I think, are really important factors that we need to bring into this conversation. I want to talk about what's going to happen or what you think leaders should be doing as we prepare for the months ahead. Maurice talked about giving children the gift of time. He also talked about the need for attention to social emotional growth. And I want to add to that a third thing, that as we go in the months ahead with children, maybe less is more. In other words, what we're hearing people talk about for restoration, people are talking a lot about restoring learning loss. I want to know if that's the right conversation, as opposed to the ideas that I've just heard from Maurice, giving children more time, not thinking that the next months are a great time to pour a lot of academics into them. People have suffered loss. How are children going to respond? How are our teachers going to respond? What would real restoration look like in the months ahead? What would real transformation look like? We have some questions in the chat about the finances of all of this. What would transformation and restoration look like?
Anyone?
Well, I mean, I liked, Maurice, when you hit on the losses that our families, our children have been experiencing, and then perhaps that's a place to start. I mean, I have a 2-year-old, well, going on 3-year-old grandson, and he went back to daycare, and I was all for it because the connectivity and the friendship were the big things for him that he lost. Just today, my son said to me, he dropped him off and he ran without even hugging him because he just wanted to go hug his teacher. And so those are those important pieces. It's not learning. It's like you said, that loss of opportunity and friendships and routine. I mean, I can't tell you how much, yeah, well, you all know this. Children love that routine of school, or just seeing friends or having snack or circle or whatever it is. And perhaps is that where we start reestablishing those important social emotional components of what's been lost during this time. And as leaders, really fostering how can we do this and helping our families connect back to that as well. And like you said, the teachers. I mean, I know you know, here where I work, one of the teachers said, how can I not let a 2-year-old hug me? How do you do that?
Mhm.
How
Yeah,
do we help them with that?
some of the comments in the chat are, we just need to let children play, begin with the social emotional programming first. You know, I'm really wondering what people are thinking, because so many governors, and like I say, the common language now is learning loss. And I want to go, is that what we really want to lead with? Any other comments on what transformation
Well,
or
maybe,
restoration might look like?
but Laura, maybe it is opportunity loss. I mean, the learning loss is a K-12 concept. I mean, and we have to be careful to distinguish ourselves, to not be lumped into the K-12 continuum or language framework. And so it is, and we have to counter that conversation. I'm glad you brought that up, because we have to have our own language, or we will be swept up in focusing on the learning loss. And I work with pre-K teachers every week. And I mean, part of what I have promoted in terms of social emotional, because even in distance learning, children still lose the opportunity for their social emotional growth. So I promoted play dates, and for small groups of children, 3 to 4, that they will come and have a play. But I had to teach the teachers what a play date is, because they thought it was another opportunity to teach the alphabet. And so, and one teacher who had a book. So, I mean, you know, the thing is that but only we, this is what I would want our folk who are part of this webinar to know. There are no quick fixes or answers. This is our collective work and adaptive leadership to figure this stuff out together. There is no book. There's nothing that is written that's going to tell, and each situation is different. But our commitment to how are the children, I mean, that should be our, that should be our mantra. And if the children are not well, then we have adaptive work to do.
Maurice, and you make me think about the listening part of what you're talking about. To work together, we must listen to each other.
Right.
And put each other in each other's shoes, if you will, so that we understand our own particular biases and those of others.
Right.
And we need our people who are in decision-making roles to reach out to community, and community needs to reach back out, but in a welcoming, friendly, authentic way. That if a community wants to offer support and help to the powers to be, that they understand that they have to accept that, because we're all walking on uncharted waters.
Right.
The last pandemic was what, 100 whatever years ago?
I wasn't here for that.
And I wasn't here for that one. I'm not 100 years old, but you know what I mean, that fine tuning our listening skills right now and being open to the new opportunity that you just described, because the old was not necessarily the best for most of our families.
Well, it was not the best. I think we
It's
can say
not the
that definitively. I think when we think about transformation and restoration, I would like to add a word to that, and that is being authentic. Because
Absolutely.
the great thing that I see now is I see a lot of early childhood educators standing up and trying to organize themselves, or at least to inform each other about what's happening in the pandemic. But I still challenge us, because as I look around the nation at some of these tables, they still are not diverse. And so this is a challenge for us when we know that our alpha children are so diverse. And when we look at our tables, they still are not diverse. There's so many examples I could name. I don't want to call any states out, but I think we've got to really go to this authenticity and this representative leadership that you mentioned earlier, Marta. I think also we have to work on definitions. I mean, I like the way the panel's talking about how we have to reframe and rethink this whole idea of what learning loss means in the early childhood space, but there's a lot of redefining. I think many of us were very excited, Maurice, like you said, when the pandemic hit. There was a lot of talk about how essential childcare was, how essential childcare workers were. But a lot of that, the money didn't necessarily follow that, as you mentioned.
Well,
And
and
so,
Laura, the real truth underlying that statement is that we need people in the workforce, and therefore we need childcare centers open. It boggles my mind that schools are not open, but childcare centers have to be open. And why is that? Because we're aligned. Childcare is aligned, and now we're calling it childcare again, not early education and care. Although some parents still go to daycare. However, because our lingo keeps changing, but childcare aligned with getting people back to work because employers need people back in the workplace.
Yes.
Not because this is good for kids, not because it's what kids should be entitled to at a young age.
Marta, but I would just add to that, yes, but we did not define the conversation. That's what I'm saying. We could have said, yes, we know it's important that people, it's a part of the economy. However, what I'm hearing from providers is yes, sir, 3 bags full. Give me the equipment that I need. And so we did not guide. This is what activists do. They seize the opportunity to change the conversation. And some things are not going to go away, but I don't know. And maybe someone on the panel can tell me, I just have not heard the strong voice and argument for equal pay, for equal work, for equal credentials. I just have in the all of the cacophony of noise, I just have not. So I stand to be corrected. Has anyone heard equal pay for equal work, for equal credentials?
Absolutely not.
No.
No, and I think people are overwhelmed. I think what you said is absolutely true. The trauma of the pandemics that we're living have people just running around trying to make it work for kids and families, trying to make it work so that their contracts are safe, trying to make it work. And so I don't know that there has been room, Maurice, to do what you're saying, right? For people to do what you're saying.
yeah, somebody in this chat is talking about, because we're all talking about equal pay, I think let's just make it explicit. We're not talking about families paying more.
No.
That is
No,
not what we're
absolutely
talking
not.
about.
No.
We're talking about a public responsibility. This is a public good that
Exactly.
should be reimbursed and paid for, just like other aspects of education are paid for.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And that's a lost opportunity. And I do think, Marta, to something you said about families and communities, and I'm seeing it in the K-12 arena, this whole notion of quality customer service and attending. One of the reasons why in communities of color that parents are not so anxious to send their children back, because they don't trust the system. And the system has done very little to build. This would have been a great time, and this applies to early care and education also. I'm not just singling out the K-12 arena, to check in on parents. Not, are you coming back? That's what everyone's been asking them. But how are you doing? These communities have been impacted far greater than any other community in terms of loss of employment, loss of housing, loss of family members. And this whole quality customer service, building relationships. And this thing has sort of, I think it was the superintendent of Baltimore said that the pandemic has blown the doors and the windows off of the schoolhouse. And parents, and I work with parents who have complained about what they see on virtual teaching, what they're hearing. I mean, it is really reducing this thing to its foundation. But this would be a good opportunity to build trusting relationships, transparent relationships, honest brokering between people who provide educational support and services to families and communities.
Thank you so much. We're going to have a reflection question for people who are listening to respond to, but I want to just pick up on what you're saying. I mean, the data is clearly showing that people of color are much more reluctant to send their children back to programs. We're seeing that very clearly. And even though people are wanting childcare so desperately. Guess what? All over America, they're not willing to put childcare workers first in line to get the vaccine, right? So here we go. Let's think a little bit more as we are moving forward. I really appreciate the comments of the panel. And we want to ask you all who are listening a question, if we can pull it up on the screen, that you might wonder, what are some of the main ideas that have come to your mind today? Some people are asking how they can get in touch with Maurice or learn more about some of these ideas. He does have a book that was referenced earlier called Doing the Right Thing for Children, which includes a lot of the ideas that he has had. Please type in the chat or the Q&A any questions you have about ideas that have come to your mind, what might have been most meaningful to you today, or what new insight you might want to act on first. We have a couple of people who've been asking about rural children, and yes, we are quite aware that rural children in rural areas suffer many of the same challenges, with the childcare deserts and lack of access to programs, really severe in rural areas. People are asking, I wonder if any of you, Corrine, especially considering the kind of work you do, they're asking about the financing. And if any of you panelists have any new ideas about how these systems and these ideas and this transformation and restoration might be financed. Somebody else is noticing that schools are paid for with property taxes for the most part. Any ideas or thoughts about the financing? Of course, that's a big webinar in itself to think about early childhood education financing, but just wondering if any of you have any immediate thoughts, since we have several questions along that line.
I do not. I mean, other than the public good, that's, if we need to move the conversation toward early care and education being a public good, and it should be financed the same way that K-12 is.
Right. I mean, and I know one of the other options, I remember Barbara Bergman's book about the economics of childcare is increasing that threshold at which parents have access to a childcare subsidy is a start. And I know I've heard inklings of that here in Massachusetts, that let's raise that bar. I mean, families at 85% of the state median income are definitely should be able to access a subsidy. Families at 125% of the state median income need help and sure could use help paying for childcare. And in that way, if we can start increasing that bar at which families can get that help, then can we raise the rates at which we pay teachers and reimburse programs for that work that they're doing. Looking at raising the reimbursement rate from the state, not to 75%, let's make it more than that, or absolutely say, okay, well, they always, in market rate studies, we look at, well, what is 75% of the market rate? Well, why are we willing to only pay 75% of the market rate? Shouldn't we be looking at paying more than that? If we want these programs to have high quality and serve our youngest children, who, as everyone on this panel knows, if we want to improve our future, we should pay for it. We should be willing and openly pay for this, for high quality access for all children. But we need to put our money where our mouth is. And
our policy.
Corrine, I think short term, there is a boatload of money coming from the feds. And short of anything, this is a time to be creative, innovative, and ask the states for flexibility in how funding is used. And the money's not going to last forever. It's probably going to be a year or two. So what can we do that begins to shift the conversation about financing, using resources that are going to become existent soon?
Well, I think the policy issue, there are countries like France and Finland where the commitment, this goes back to what is our overall attitude toward children. And if we rely on the subsidy system or increasing the number of people who can be in the subsidy system, that still is not the public good. It doesn't answer the public good question. And I think, I mean, everyone's excited about the money that's coming down and everyone's figuring out how they're going to spend it. And that, as you say, it's a one time, maybe we'll get two times, but we're not lifting up the larger conversation. And someone in the chat put Reggio Emilia, where there is a municipality that has committed to having high quality, but that's where we should be lifting the conversation. You know, programs for poor children become poor children's programs. And we have to, you know, we have to move that conversation in terms of universality of, and so, I mean, I just think that that's what we should be pushing for.
Well, I think our time has come to an end. Lots of questions, but I think when we say the question wanted new leadership, I think that one strong message out of this whole webinar is what we have been doing in the past, and we have been working very hard. It is not enough and it is not sufficient to deal with the challenges that we now face, and that we need to be thinking differently, authentically, with representative leadership about how to transform and how to restore our pathways for all children, all children. That's where we are right now. I want to thank all of you for participating in this panel. For all of you who are listening, I know there's hundreds of you out there. We have not been able to get to all of your questions. Tomorrow, we will be sending out a follow-up email in an attempt to answer some of the questions. But I want to just remind all of us that this is a journey. As Maurice and I were talking earlier, this is adaptive leadership. It's a journey. It's going to require us to come together and think differently and think about our future and not just our present challenges. And we need to remember that we're coming to this future with a lot of assets. We have passion. We're creative. We're resilient. We've demonstrated that we're able to persevere. We should bring our assets to the table, all of us together, and think about how we are going to reform and transform our systems for children and families right now. I want to invite you all. There were some things in the chat asking about my book. If you put in this promo code from Red Leaf Press, you'll be able to get a 15% discount off of it right away. And I do want to also invite you to come to our CAYL Catalyst webinar that we're having March 4th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And what we're going to have is real talk about young Latino children and how we change the game for young Latino children. Luis Hernandez will be our main speaker, and we will have, again, 2 practitioners to respond to him. Thank all of you for joining us today. We hope you'll come back in March. We hope that this conversation has stimulated new questions that you may have, but also reinforce your commitment to make a difference in the lives of the children and family we serve. Thank you so much for joining us.